Quite a setup here. All right, welcome to the Uncovered podcast. Today we have Michael Rubin. Dr. Rubin is a senior fellow at the American Enterprise Institute, AEI. He specializes in Iran, Turkey, and the broader Middle East. Dr. Rubin is a former Pentagon official and has lived in post-revolution Iran, in Yemen, and both pre- and post-war Iraq. He also spent time with the Taliban before 9/11. Dr. Rubin is the author, co-author, and co-editor of several books exploring diplomacy, Iranian history, Arab culture, Kurdish studies, and Shi-ite politics. Dr. Rubin has a PhD and MA in history from Yale University, where he also obtained a BS in biology. Thank you so much for joining us today.
Hey, thanks for having me.
So, as we mentioned, we can get into policy and talk about that for a long time, but I really want to hear from you about your experiences living in Iran and some of your knowledge on Iranian history and how it relates to today. So if we can just start, you were an American with a PhD in Iranian history, living in Iran during the Rafsanjani era, during the Khatami era. Can you just start by telling us a little bit about your experiences during that time, and I guess what drew you to that and why you were there?
Well, my freshman year in college was actually Operation Desert Storm. And I was already taking Middle East history, but it reinforced the fact that the Middle East wasn't simply the Arab-Israeli conflict. Now, I'd gone to Yale University, and I'd gone as a biology major. But during the 1950s, all the Ivy League schools actually decided to divide up the world. And so Yale did Iranian history and Russian history. Harvard did the Arabs. Princeton did the Turks. Cornell did Southeast Asia. And those divisions eventually went away. But the legacy was that Yale's program was always heavy on Iran. And so I had studied under Abbas Amanat. Now, I got fascinated by Iranian history. Abbas, of course, was or is a professor of Qajar history. And it was like peeling an onion, so many different layers. And what really fascinated me about Iran is when you have a near contiguous history going back 2,000 years, it's not just the military history, it's not just the political history or the diplomatic history. You also have the intellectual history, which really sets Iran apart from all the different places around it. So when it came time to do my dissertation, I got good advice. A lot of people find a very sexy subject. They pursue their dissertation, and in the end, they figure out they don't have enough material to finish it. What Abbas and other Iranian studies people advised me, because here I was, an American Jew who was working on Iranian history, was find something where you have all the documents. And then if you can get to Iran, that's just icing on the cake. And so several people suggested to me I work on the Telegraph, which may sound boring. It may make people's eyes roll back in their head. But when you think about it, how did 19th century Iran under Nasser al-Din Shah survive and not get formally colonized? They were getting weaker, they were getting poorer, but because they were able to have intelligence coming from the frontiers from their border, Nasser al-Din Shah, unlike those who came before him, could decide where to deploy the military here, there, and really save money. In a way, it saved Iran. And I also looked at how this could create the mass movement. Why was there a constitutional revolution in the first decade of the 20th century? But before then, a lot of the mass movements hadn't worked. What was different? And I argued a lot of that was technology. It also was religious. Why is it that you today have just a couple marja at-taqlids? But back 150 years ago, you could have a dozen. But with the Telegraph, people could talk directly to the marja, and it expanded their authority. And the same thing happened with economics. Because remember, until the 1890s, Iran didn't really have paper currency. And so everything would have to be done in coin. Now you could do things from London banks, from Paris banks, from German banks, and then just have telegraph arrangements from agents in Iran. Look, I don't need to get too deep into the historical weeds, but I had the opportunity to go as an academic. And the first time, like you said, was under President Rafsanjani. I studied in two different places, Muassaseh de Khoda, near Tadrish, which of course is, they published the most famous Persian dictionary. And then I also had studied at a startup place in Isfahan called the Anna Marie Schimmel Institute, which for me was much better because instead of just studying the poetry, the literature, I was a historian. I wanted to study history. And so they had me read history books. They had me with one-on-one tutoring, read newspapers. And let's face it, living in Isfahan is also wonderful. But I mean, it was an education being plopped down in the middle of Iran. I mean, at that point, I wasn't even really fully conversant in Persian. I've lost a lot of my Persian, but I mean, I was able to get by and learn and so forth. And so I lived for 4.5 months in Isfahan, for 2.5 months in Tehran. And it was fantastic just taking taxis, taking buses, experiencing the hospitality of the Iranian people. I don't mean to rabbit on too much, but I once went to Shiraz because I wanted to see Takhshi Jamshid and all that. And then I was living in Isfahan at the time, and I was going to fly back to Isfahan. Of course, because of the subsidies on Iranian aviation, it cost me $10, but the flight was canceled. So I was told I'd have to take a bus, but there was no bus direct to Isfahan. So they told me to get a bus to Tehran and to tell the bus driver to let me off as we passed Isfahan on the outskirts, and then I could just hitchhike in. Well, as you know, in Iran, you have the bus driver, and the long-haul buses, you have the bus driver's helper, and they quickly found out that there was an American in their midst. And so Ta'aruf being what it is, Iranian hospitality being what it was and is, they didn't simply want to leave me off on the corner of the highway outside Isfahan. They took the whole bus to my apartment in southern Isfahan to drop me off at my door. I mean, that's what encapsulated Iran at the time for me.
Sure. No, that's a perfect anecdote to explain, how your experiences kind of shaped your views on the region. So I guess we can get into a little bit more of just Iranian history then. I guess my main question: what parts of Iranian history should policymakers be knowledgeable about? And alternatively, on the flip side of that, it said every country has its founding myths. What are some of Iran's, and can you explain how that's influenced by Iranian history?
Well, I'd say 2 points really stick out for me. Number one is again, Iranian intellectual history. The concept of Iranness and how Iran built up strategy. A lot of the strategies which Iran and Iranians embrace predate the Islamic Republic. And this is the key point for the United States. The Islamic Republic is not always Iran. In fact, it's almost like an imperialistic construct, an Arab construct, if you will, that's imposed upon Iran and tries to repress a lot of the Iranness. But putting that aside, there are some strategical similarities that are different from the way Americans do business. So I go back to the princely literature, for example. I think all American strategists should read Nizam al-Mulk's Siyasat-Nameh, the book of kingship, the book of policy. Excuse my poor translations. At any rate, the point is it gives insight into how, while Americans might streamline, an Iranian concept of leadership isn't necessarily about streamlining. Sometimes it can be about duplication. So who's really in charge? Is it policing? Is it the law enforcement forces, or is it the besieged? Who's in charge of some of the repression? Is it simply the Islamic Revolutionary Guard Corps, the Pastaran, or is it the Itilat, the Ministry of Intelligence? And the answer to both those questions is yes, because they compete with each other, they inform on each other, and it's something that we need to understand. At the same time, look, the Iranian regime are masters at creating a false perception that is in contradiction to the reality of history. And we need to call them out on that. So, for example, during the Mossadegh era, I'm not going to relitigate 1953, but the important thing to remember is that the clergy were against the Shah. The clergy were against Mossadegh. Mm-hmm. If you read Mohammad Reza Shah's biography, he has a chapter called The Reds versus the Blacks. The Reds, of course, referred to Tudeh. The Blacks, of course, referred to the Khund, the clergy with the black turbans. And so this notion that somehow the clergy today stood with Mossadegh for democracy is absolute nonsense. And we've got to stop pretending that somehow the Islamic Republic has anything to do with democracy. It's not. The Islamic Republic is 100% about repression. It's not about democracy at all. So this slippery slope we've had in Washington, where starting with President Obama, perhaps even earlier with President Clinton, we've combined this notion of the Islamic Republic with the Iranian people. That's always a mistake. I mean, on Nowruz greetings, we should greet the Iranians, not the 10% of thought leaders in Iran who might support this dictatorship.
Yeah, I think it's an interesting topic, especially with elections coming up in Iran currently, and the way that some in the United States and the West both are offering condolences for the former Iranian President Raisi's death and talking about this new election coming up as if, I saw someone on CNN suggesting that this is a chance for Khamenei to take a new step in a new direction for Iran. It's such an outdated concept. It's something that maybe once was plausible but has fully died down. They don't let genuine reformist candidates run, right? So elections are clearly not run the way they are in any actual democracy.
Well, I mean, let's also just talk about legitimacy here. And this is actually one of the biggest eye-openers I got from actually being in Iran. So I live near the university in the center of Tehran. And every day or 5 days a week, I would go up to the Tadrish area. And Tadrish, look, it's beautiful. And you have a lot of privileged people that live there. But I'd also spend time in Western Tehran, where a lot of veterans of the Islamic Revolutionary Guard Corps live, or in impoverished areas like Islamshar to the south of Tehran. And what quickly became apparent is when you have an anchor from a Western media outlet, let's say Christian Amanpour, parachuting in and talking from Tadrish about what Iranians think, that's like someone talking from the Upper West Side of Manhattan about what people in rural Iowa think. You just can't do it, and it's arrogant to believe that you can. And then as I've traveled further afield in Iran, I spend a lot of time in Iraq, in Najaf and Karbala, and so I get a good cross-section of Iranians with whom I can talk because I can no longer go to Iran. I mean, what's clear is that number one, the Islamic Republic looks at their elections, and specifically voting, as a sign of legitimacy, as an endorsement of legitimacy. Why we accept statistics from them when we will go over everything in American elections with a fine-tooth comb is beyond me. You should never trust data from dictators. But beyond that, when I talk, for example, to people from the Kurdistan province of Iran, they say, look, if we have to go vote, if we want to have our civil servants jobs, if we want to be school teachers, if we want to be municipal workers, and we need to have these salaries. But what they then do, and to prove that they voted, they have to take their national ID card, get it stamped. But then what they do is they purposely spoil their ballot. And this is something the Americans don't pick up on, but it really is a nonviolent form of resistance to the Islamic Republic. And the ultimate irony is, while Americans don't pick up on it, I've counted at least 2 speeches that the Supreme Leader, Ali Khamenei, has given about spoiled ballots. So clearly it's on their radar, and yet we're projecting good faith where none exists.
Yeah, absolutely. I think it's shocking to see so consistently. I mean, it's a very easy way to present the illegitimacy of the Islamic Republic, and we just don't take it for some reason. We play into their hands, and it's frustrating. You mentioned the Kurds in Iran. You have taken a very outspoken stance on the calls for separatism in Iran, the calls for ethnic minorities to rise up and create their own states. Can you explain, a mutual friend of ours, I wrote a piece with him also saying this. Can you explain why you've taken such a stance on this and the importance of it in your mind?
Well, first of all, the reason why I take any particular stance is because of what I believe, based on experience, based on research, and so forth. So living in Iran made clear to me that the ethnic separatist arguments have no legitimacy among the vast majority of the Iranian people, including those from the provinces where these separatist movements exist. And some people might, is there dissension against the central government? Yes, especially among the Kurds and the Baluch, because under the Islamic Republic, there's two whammies against them. Number one is ethnic discrimination, and number two is sectarian discrimination, especially if they happen to be much more Sunni in their population than Shia. But putting that aside, Iran, as we said before, is a country that predates many of the nation states which we have today. It's one of the few countries on earth, like I said, with a near contiguous history going back 2,000 years. I actually probably shouldn't admit this, but in grad school, there was one of us every year in Iranian studies, and we used to go out to a bar on Friday evenings. And because we thought it was cool, we'd play a little drinking game where we'd try to name all the leaders of Iran going back 2,000 years. So you have Ali Khamenei, Ruhollah Khomeini, Mohammad Reza Shah, Ahmad Shah, Muhammad Ali Shah, Muzaffar al-Din Shah, Nasruddin Shah, and so on and so on and so forth. None of us got married until we were in our 30s. It wasn't as cool as we thought it was. But the point of this is you have, this notion of an ethnically based nation state really started in the late 19th, early 20th century. The concept of Iranian nationalism, Persian nationalism, predates that by a millennia. And so this notion that somehow we can project our own sense of history, which for Americans is 10 years long, upon a people like Iran and all Iranians is nonsense. And it's also ignorant because even within the Islamic Republic, you have an ethnic hodgepodge. What's the ethnicity of the supreme leader of Iran? It's Azeri. And when you talk to the Iranian Kurds, who are the most brutal units of the Islamic Revolutionary Guard Corps who are repressing the Kurds, they are ethnic Azeris, sort of like the Russians use Chechen units to do their dirty work. And the fact of the matter is, it's a complex web that our own narrow sort of perspectives as American policymakers rotating in and out of positions every 2 years doesn't really appreciate. And so it's wrong. But as our mutual friend, and if I can give him a shout out, Shi-ite has said, one of the other metrics you can use is whose team, whose football team do ordinary Iranians of various ethnicities clamor for? Support. Most Iranians actually support and are damn proud of the national Iranian football team. Now, could you have ethnic taunts and so forth at regional games? Yes, but as someone who's from Philadelphia, you can get ethnic taunts in Philadelphia when we're playing, or regional taunts when the Eagles are playing Pittsburgh or Detroit or what have you. So again, these are people who are coming from outside Iran with a wishful thinking, which simply isn't accurate. And what gets me even more is it's not only inaccurate, it's actively destructive. Because what the Iranian people again and again have said is they want freedom from this regime. They want freedom to live their lives as normal country and as individuals. How dare anyone come and say, we're going to take apart your country? Because that's not what the Iranians are asking for. Iranians are nationalistic. Arguably, the best thing that ever happened to Ayatollah Khomeini's ability to consolidate power was Saddam Hussein's invasion of Iran in 1980, because it allowed Khomeini to rally people around the flag as the regime was starting to come to unravel. So why would we snatch defeat from the jaws of victory like this? And to me, it's absolutely astounding that anyone could be so very stupid.
So many people have advised for so long.
Yeah.
You've been in government advising things like this. There's ideas of how to support the Iranian people, how to pressure Iran. We have maximum support at Nufti as our strategic policy initiative. You've written about a lot of these things. Why can't we actually get these policies enacted in the United States over the last 20 years?
Look, part of it would be, there's two parts of this. I'm shooting down some strategies, like the ethnic strategy. And it's fair to ask, well, what's the alternative? And very briefly, I would say that the alternative is to support what the Islamic Republic, what the regime is most frightened about, are movements that span geographic location ethnicity, gender, and social class. And this is why, for example, the Iranian government cracks down, tortures, imprisons, and murders environmentalists. Because when you look at the environmental degradation that happens outside the Bandar Abbas, Bushehr area, Sulia, and so forth, or if you look at how the Ziandarud dried up near in Isfahan, it wasn't because of climate change, it was because the Pasdaran and Khatam al-Anbiya, the economic wing of the Revolutionary Guards, were getting contracts to basically embezzle money to build unnecessary dams. So you have environmental movements, you have organized labor, because it doesn't matter whether you are a Gilaki from Rasht, or whether you are an Arab from Ahwaz, or a Baluch from Zahedan. I mean, if you're working in a factory that's run by the Revolutionary Guard and you don't have safe working conditions, if your money's not being paid on time, that's a rallying cry for absolutely everyone. So you have labor, you have environmentalism, and then this is actually the strength of the woman life freedom movement as well, because of course it wasn't just women, it was women and their allies, but it spanned the whole gamut. This is what the regime is afraid of. Now, why aren't we more successful about this? Number one is projection. Too many Americans will actually, come in arrogantly, the world revolves around us. They don't actually take the 5 minutes that's needed to research Iran. A lot of it's also because the Iranian regime has been quite good at placing agents of influence and creating organizations that lobby in the name of the Iranian people when they're actively, in effect, lobbying for the Islamic Republic. And some of these are specific upstart organizations, which when they are caught red-handed, simply ignore it, or perhaps they change their name and go to a different organization. And some of these are organizations, there's been a lot of public debate with regard to what exactly was happening within the International Crisis Group, for example, where they will take the good name of that organization and use it for very partisan political purposes. And so I would actually argue that the Islamic Republic has been very good at creating a web of influence in Washington, and that's one of the vulnerabilities of us being a democracy. But I think a lot of people are calling this out, and increasingly the reason why people are calling this out is because when you juxtapose what certain organizations, for example, like the National Iranian American Council had for years been saying, what the Iranian people they said wanted, versus the imagery we get from the streets of Tehran, the streets of Isfahan, the streets of Kashan, the streets of Mashhad. That's hard to rectify even for someone who, in my view, is too apologetic to the Islamic Republic.
Yeah, very well said. I want to go back quickly to one thing you mentioned about the rally around the flag effect after Saddam invaded. There's a lot of commentary now saying, the people inside of Iran want Israel to attack IRGC facilities. They want Israel and the United States to help weaken Iran's military, to help them in their fight for a new regime. A, could you see that being true? Have you seen any evidence of that? B, if something like that were to happen, do you think there would be some kind of rally around the flag effect? If so, why? If not, why not?
Well, let me put it this way. When I lived in Iran, Iranians are very cosmopolitan, especially compared to all the peoples living around them. And I used to study and go to a historical sort of grad student circle at University of Tehran, that was run by a professor who I think is actually still alive, Mansoura Nezamafi, who was also a publisher. And one time I was pulled aside by one of her students and said, "I'm so sorry to ask you, Michael, but with a name like Rubin, are you Jewish?" And I never hide it. And I said, "Well, as a matter of fact, I am." And she said, "Well, I went to kindergarten with someone who is Jewish. Would you like me to introduce you to her so that you could meet the community?" There doesn't seem to be any real animosity towards Israel. Quite frankly, a lot of people are also sympathetic politically to the position of the Palestinians, but they don't excuse terrorism because, after all, the Iranians themselves have been victims of terrorism, the Mujahideen al-Khalq terrorism, and so forth. So you do have that aspect of the situation. But, let me put it this way. The goal of our policy to help the Iranian people should be to fracture the Islamic Revolutionary Guard Corps. If you want to know how I would do it, one way I would do it without bombing, it would be this. As you know, I used to teach for the U.S. Navy. And the U.S. Navy not only has aircraft carriers and destroyers and submarines, we also have hospital ships where, we can send them to an earthquake zone. We can send them, to New York during COVID. Well, why not send the USNS Comfort, one of our hospital ships, to Dubai, and then put out a public call saying, we are willing to give free medical care to Islamic Revolutionary Guard Corps veterans. When I used to live in Iran, and the first time was 8 years after the Iran-Iraq War, and the people may complain in the United States about our Department of Veterans Affairs and veterans hospitals. Nothing compared to how the Iranian regime has mistreated those who laid their life on the lines to defend Iran from Saddam Hussein. So why not put out an open call? Come to Dubai, we'll give you free medical care. Two things could happen. One, they could be allowed to come to Dubai and get free medical care, and think about what sign that would send to the regime. And it could also be an intelligence coup. Or the regime would forbid the Islamic Revolutionary Guard Corps veterans from coming. And that would just create dissension. But could the Iranians then respond by blowing up the hospital ship in Dubai? The answer to that's probably no, because what? The United Arab Emirates has $400 billion worth of Iranian investment. Is Iran really going to want to lose all that? The short answer is there's a lot of creative nonviolent mechanisms which we could utilize in order to help the Iranian people. The important thing is, look, if you're going to have regime change, it's got to come from inside. Iran has been victimized through the ages by any number of foreign powers. And you could argue in 1905, the Belgians, then the British and the Russians, of course, with their, what we would call today, debt diplomacy. The Americans were initially invited in because we were seen as apolitical. Well, how did that work out for Iran? And now the Iranians are turning towards China. You really think China is disinterested or cares about Iranian pride? Just ask the Pakistanis as they become virtually a colony of China. The fact of the matter is the Iranians got to take matters into their own hands. What I would say is the outside world could help ordinary Iranians in a number of ways. Why is it that European green parties, for example, will support environmentalism every place on earth except Iran? And why is it that international labor organizations will support international labor everywhere on earth except in Iran? What Iranians need are strike funds so that they can feed their families and basically resist the Islamic Revolutionary Guard Corps and its economic wing at the same time. That would be real leadership. That would be real support.
Absolutely. I think a strike fund has been mentioned and brainstormed, and a lot of people are trying to figure out how exactly to make it work, but political will is an essential component of that. In terms of fracturing the IRGC, fracturing the security apparatus, have you read or thought about something like a defection infiltration program run by the U.S., similar to Eastern Bloc kind of defection program?
I think it's a great idea. And one of the things that's always, it's a great idea. So I'll leave that there. But look, as someone inside the U.S. government, so much depends on what the question that is asked is for how we view a situation. So what I would urge is for Congress, by law, to demand a report, a public report with regard to various issues, factionalization, and so forth within the Islamic Revolutionary Guard Corps. The State Department doesn't make policy. It carries it out. If you really want to affect change, you have to work through Congress. So it should be a bipartisan issue. We talk about so-called hardliners versus reformers, although the Iranians don't use the term hardliners themselves, the principalists and the reformers in politics. But what are the factional divisions within the Revolutionary Guard? We all know, for example, that some people facing conscription will simply go into the Revolutionary Guard because you get more gasoline rations, you get a slightly higher salary. Yeah, you have to put up with some douchebag trying to proselytize to you about regime ideology on weekends, but it's still, could be better service than being stuck in certain areas as a conscript. But they're not true believers. But other people go into the revolution. We have to admit, some people go into the Revolutionary Guard and they become true believers. You can go in at age 8 into after-school programs, the equivalent in the American context of evil Boy Scouts. And you can go to universities that are run by the Revolutionary Guard. And if you have been indoctrinated, maybe someone like Mahmoud Ahmadinejad, the former president, wasn't simply ranting off things he didn't believe. The scary thing was he's ranting off things he had been taught and really believed. Because, of course, of all recent presidents, Ahmadinejad was the first who didn't come from a clerical background. The first since the very early days of the Islamic Republic. And therefore, the reason analysts like me got so concerned by what he was saying was he was really reflecting the ideology at play among a true believer in the Revolutionary Guard. But this is what we also have Magnitsky Act sanctions for. So why don't we make use of them?
On the legitimacy of the Iranian, you wrote an op-ed recently about the potential for dynastic succession in Iran, and you discussed the legitimacy crisis it faces. Can you talk a little bit about how you see that playing out in the near future, especially with Raisi gone?
He just had a hard landing. You got to trust the Iranian media, at any rate. So you're absolutely right. Look, Raisi was largely seen as on a dry run to succeed Khamenei as supreme leader. This is only, if there is another succession, it will be the second succession and the third Rahbar, the third leader. Because you had Khomeini from 1979 until June 3rd, 1989. And of course, for people who are old enough, you remember that there was a heat wave when he died in Tehran, and the quip on the street was the old man was so senile, he forgot to close the door on the way down. And then Khamenei was accepted as a compromise candidate because he was seen as weak. He was seen as a bit of buffoon. And therefore, he was someone that Rafsanjani could accept, that the Pastaran could accept, and all the different power centers. But look, Khamenei surprised a lot of people. He consolidated power. He went after and one by one kneecapped the people that put him in power so that they couldn't take him out of power. But now he's 85 years old. He's partially paralyzed from that 1981 assassination attempt. He has been publicly treated for cancer, for prostate cancer, and he may have had a medical emergency last year where his plane, I think, made an emergency landing in Chalus as he was coming back from, I think, Mashhad. So Raisi was seen as a potential successor to him. Raisi had, he had the right CV for it, even though when I talked to Iranians, they said he was too much of a cipher. He just reflected. Well, putting that all aside, Raisi's gone. So who else is out there? It's no secret that Ali Khamenei has been trying to promote Mujtaba, his son. Now, when I would talk to people in Iraq who go back and forth and so forth, and Iraqi leaders and people, including people who are associated with the Pastaran, they would say that, our bet's on Raisi, but if Mujtaba were going to take the lead, it would have to be part of a council. And so again, citing Sheikh Hateri, and this actually goes back to an earlier debate in the first years of the Islamic Republic that the Tel Aviv University historian David Menashri had also written about. There's nothing that says that the leadership has to be a single person. It could be a council. So you could have the rhetoric now saying, hey, look, Ruhollah Khomeini and Ali Khamenei were such singular figures, it's going to be impossible to replace them with another individual. It's going to take a council of a number of people to replace them. Now, no matter what, however, if Mujtaba is coming out in front or part of this council, how can Khomeini and then Khamenei rail against the Pahlavi regime and the monarchy in general by saying it's illegitimate to have hereditary rule and then impose hereditary rule? And you know what? Even though they weren't religious republics, Hosni Mubarak tried this with his son Gamal. How did that work out for them? Muammar Gaddafi tried this with his son Saif. And to be fair, Hafiz al-Assad succeeded with his son Bashar. But how did that really work out for the Syrian people, considering the civil war? So you have any number of legitimate crises. I mean, look, today I think the Islamic Republic is what I would call a zombie regime. It's like North Korea in that regard. Absolutely no sense of popular legitimacy, but they're controlling things through the power of the gun. You know who else tried to do that? Nicolae Ceausescu in Romania. It doesn't work for long. And at this point, put it this way, I wouldn't want to bet money on the future of the Islamic Republic.
And I think a lot of people were looking at Raisi's death as maybe a moment to spark a new protest.
I think
movement.
it's a dry run, at least.
Maybe,
I mean,
right.
look, when you have fireworks in his birthplace of Mashhad, that's really telling, because when Americans set off fireworks, let's say something happens to Joe Biden or Donald Trump. I mean, I'll be bipartisan in this regard. Our politics are so polarized that some people may set off fireworks. But you know when they do that? They're not risking arrest. They're not risking torture. They're not risking death. That the Iranians are shows just how deep-seated and the hatred of this regime is, and the risk Iranians are willing to take to resist it. So I do suspect that what we are seeing now, and the fact that the Iranians are afraid to really pronounce a situation with public mourning for fear of what will happen, that they know that there's a problem moving forward. And just one other anecdote. So I first went to Iran, like I said, in 1996. And this was 8 years after the war ended. I went to the tomb of Ayatollah Khomeini. And for those of you who have seen Shia tombs, and I assume many of your audience have, I mean, very fancy, beautiful mausoleums. And usually there's a gold cage with banners with sayings of Imam Hussein or Quranic surah or what have you. And then the casket is inside the silver cage. And people will slide money into it as donations. Well, when I went back in 1999, 3 years later, I saw that Khomeini's cage had been covered with plexiglass. And I asked someone about this, and they said people were taking the Toman, putting, excuse my language, dog shit inside, and slipping it into Khomeini's tomb. I mean, this just shows you, even back then, how illegitimate this regime had become.
So in anticipation of this upcoming crisis, I think we would argue the U.S. was not ready for the Women, Life, Freedom protests. We were preoccupied with a nuclear deal, and we just weren't ready to support the people. What do you think the top things are that the United States needs to prepare for Khamenei's death for this potential next spark?
Well, first of all, let me be a little optimistic.
Sure.
One of the criticisms of the Women, Life, Freedom movement is it didn't really have inside Iran a single charismatic figure. But is that a weakness or a strength? When we look at the wide expanse of Iranian history, what other movement was successful that didn't really have a single charismatic figure? It was the Constitutional Revolution. And so this notion that democracy is an outside construct doesn't hold for Iranians, because Iran had its own experience around 1909 to 1915, 1916. Now, that movement didn't have a single figure, and so this could be a healthy issue. But we have to game this out. Mm-hmm. First of all, we have to recognize that there should not be any statements of condolence for the death of Khamenei. If someone wants to get up on the floor of Congress and say good riddance, I'd be okay with. But, I mean, the State Department auto drive, where we have to bestow legitimacy upon the butcher of Tehran, that's bad enough. But Khamenei is the butcher of Iran. I mean, he took what Raisi did on a local scale and made it national. Global.
Regional.
I mean, I would actually say global. I mean, when we look at what happened in Buenos Aires in 1994 and right. So forth, Vienna in 1989, the Mykonos Cafe in 1992. Anyway,
yeah.
What we have to be clear of is where we want Iran to go. And what we should do from outside is come up with a policy of first, do no harm. So if we want Iran to be allowed to become a liberal representative democracy or liberal representative government of some point, we shouldn't do anything to get in the way. Now, as I game this forward, what I worry most about is the Islamic Revolutionary Guard Corps trying to prevent either a smooth succession or fearing how much money they have at stake given the extent of their own businesses. What could happen, what they might do. So then the problem from the United States and a way to help the Iranian people is, what can we do to freeze, if not confiscate, the assets of the Islamic Revolutionary Guard Corps, of Khatam al-Anbiya? And when I say confiscate, I don't mean using for the Americans. But if it's being held in Dubai, if it's being held in London real estate, if it's being held anywhere else in the world, in India, in Singapore, and China, I'm not sure I trust the Chinese on this, but what can we do to freeze those assets? And if these assets we deem belong to the Iranian people, what can we do to then transfer them to the Iranian people, to a democratically legitimate Iranian public? So what I would say the United States role should be is not to bestow legitimacy on an illegitimate regime, but rather try to remove the obstacles that the Iranian people might find in their way as we move forward. Could we do things with strike funds? We already talked about that. Could we do things with communications? Mm-hmm. Presumably we can. Could we do things with helping with transportation by allowing Iranians to have, if Iran is politically split, to allow people to be able to go from Tabriz to Qazvin to Tehran quicker? Why not lend some modern, maintained aircraft? And there's any numbers of things we can do to help. Unfortunately, we have to have the imagination to do that. We need to recognize, and this also really came into sharp focus for me when I lived in Iran, we need to recognize that over the 2,000 plus year of Iranian history, the Islamic Republic is not the political apex of this. It is an anomaly. And that should be a lesson that every Central Intelligence Agency analyst, every State Department diplomat, and every Pentagon official is trained in and forced to accept. They can't, just because they may be, 35 years old and have known nothing other than the Islamic Republic. They shouldn't be under the illusion that the Islamic Republic is anything other than an anomaly and, in the broad sweep of Iranian history, a historical embarrassment.
How much experience have you had with the Iranian diaspora?
Quite honestly, I try to, I'm not Iranian, and therefore there's a limit to how much I'll actually spend with the Iranian diaspora. I figure there's enough people who do that. It is, there are certain groups which personally I tend to sympathize more with and like better, and those are the groups that I would show up to their conferences or to their podcasts. But there are other groups that I don't need the headache. Oftentimes when I do my research on Iran, I'll go to Najaf, I'll go to Karbala, I'll go to Yerevan, I'll go to any of the cities surrounding Iran and be able to talk to ordinary Iranians there.
Okay. Well, what I wanted to ask is, I guess, what do you view as the role of a diaspora in policy? Especially, it's somewhat of a unique circumstance in the Iranian diaspora.
Okay. Look, the way I kind of look at this is, and again, this is my own personal view, this isn't going to be a situation like Iraq in any name, shape, or form. And this notion that there will be a number of people from outside Iran who are going to flood back and take the jobs of the Iranian bureaucrats is absolute nonsense. I'd say that's Islamic Republic or National Iranian American Council propaganda. It simply is not going to happen. Ordinary Iranians want nothing but the best for Iran. When I talk to people in the Islamic Republic's bureaucracy, and even fairly senior people, and remember, I think I'm the only American who had met both Ibrahim Raisi and Esmail Qani. That's a story for another day. And I wouldn't say that either of them were anything other than rabid true believers. But most other Iranians who I meet when I'm in Afghanistan, when I'm in Tajikistan, when I'm in any of the surrounding countries, you can see in their eyes and in their answers, and frankly, they will sometimes tell you directly that they are no longer true believers. It reminded me when I went to Cuba this past January, even Cuban government officials would sometimes give the party line and then want to talk about their sons or daughters-in-law in Long Island. So you have that situation with the Iranians. The Iranian bureaucracy is going to be safe, but there's a brain trust outside Iran. And that brain trust can contribute a great deal. Iran is going to be in desperate need of revamping some of its laws in order to attract investment to build Iranian jobs inside Iran. And that's something which both the diaspora and ordinary Iranians can work together on. And then there are some other figures. And here I would say outright, someone like Reza Pahlavi, who is a unifier. Reza Pahlavi understands the drawbacks and the faults and the historical legacy of his father. And he doesn't want to replicate that. However, he can unite. I would just say that I went to a wedding, now about 12 years ago, in which Reza Pahlavi was going to be a guest. And because, he was going to be more than a guest. He was going to be a best man at the wedding. And because of this, for security's sake, the wedding was on an island, and admission to this island was easily controlled. Now, it was a wedding between someone who was much closer to the traditional monarchy and someone whose family was much more associated with the Tudeh. Leftist, traditionally anti-monarchy. And a lot of that person's family were going to fly in from Iran, and they didn't know that Reza Pahlavi was going to be at the wedding. And just as an analyst, I'm not a partisan on this, as an analyst, to see people who had been outside of Iran had been in Iran for the last 33 years, had supported the Islamic Revolution, when they came, and when they, without knowing in advance this would happen, when they saw Reza Pahlavi, when they saw the Shah, they got down on their knees, they cried, they bowed, they kissed his hand. It was absolutely astounding. And perhaps cynics could say the grass is always greener on the other side. But the fact of the matter is, he has a potential, an amazing potential to be a unifying figure in order to, for example, chair or facilitate a new constitutional convention as the Iranians move forward, first with a provisional government, then with a constitution, and then with national elections.
Yeah, I think that's really important, and that's something we've spent a lot of time working on, just in terms of the unity aspect, uniting the diaspora, specifically around the policies that we're talking about. Because when you look at things like the Mass Act and some of the legislation that the community has been pushing, it's very clear that the community can unite. When we talk about these things, we all have the same opinion. We all agree on.
And I'd also say U.S. strategy is always stronger when the strategy is based on principles rather than a single person.
Yes, absolutely. I have about 10 more policy questions I could ask you, but we're about 50 minutes in. I think we'll end it there. So thank you so much for joining us. This is a really incredible discussion.
Thanks for having me.
Absolutely.